I'd like to hand it over now to the Honourable Jenny Macklin. Jenny, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Diann, for that incredibly warm welcome. And along with everyone here, I want to acknowledge that we are on traditional Aboriginal land and pay our respects to elders past and present. And like Diann, I especially want to acknowledge all the young people in the audience, the young women in the audience today. It is just fantastic to see you all here and to know that you too want to take up the mantle of leadership in our society. I think it's just wonderful. Thank you, Diann, so much for what you've done to help inspire and encourage these young women, and for all you do in your working life. I am especially pleased to be here with Sharon Bird, who's a great friend of mine, and you are incredibly lucky to have her as your local member. She's a delightful human being, but she's also just a fantastic fighter for the Illawarra, and we love having you. Thank you. Happy International Women's Day to everybody. I must say, I think if you want to be happy, join those drummers. Did you see the smiles on their faces? It was the most wonderful sight. I thought, give up politics, go drumming. It was just absolutely wonderful. Congratulations to you all. Now, the theme of today's event is gaining the unexpected. So, of course, I've given that some thought. It got me thinking about the importance of International Women's Day, and got me thinking right back to the early suffragettes and all of the struggles and battles that they went through. I think it is very important for all of us on this day to remember the women who went before us, who struggled so hard to get us the vote, to get us so many of the rights that we are able to take advantage of today. There were the women who, of course, who were elected in some ways not that long ago into the federal parliament when you think of the history. But one of the women that I remember very well from my early days of getting involved in Labor politics was Susan Ryan. She was Senator in Canberra in the 1980s and a senior minister in the Hawke government. And she pioneered the anti-discrimination and equal opportunity legislation that led to the really landmark Sex Discrimination Act in 1984 and the Affirmative Action Act in 1986. And even though the Human Rights Commission was established around 30 years ago, they today say still the most common form of discrimination, the most common complaint they get is around pregnancy. So yes, it's wonderful that we have a Human Rights Commission, that the Sex Discrimination Act exists, but it is still the case that in our workplaces, discrimination on the grounds of pregnancy is still widespread. Now, I'm sure many of you were as disappointed as I was about the American elections and the fact that Hillary Clinton was not elected president. The reaction of so many women, not just here in Australia but around the world, was really one, I think, of despair and in some ways disbelief, and a very tough reminder to us all about how the chips are stacked against so many of us. Sexism, discrimination, we saw it all, didn't we, in the American election. But of course it's not just in politics. So many women in Australia are paid less than men, and it seems to be one of the most difficult things to shift, the gender pay gap. I had the great pleasure earlier this week to meet some of the young women who are playing football in Melbourne, joined the AFL Women's League, and one of the first topics that came up, actually from some of the young schoolgirls who were with us that day, was about the gender pay gap on the footy field. All of these women, I'm pleased to say, Sharon, are all members of the Players Association, all campaigning for equal pay on the footy field, just like all of us are still campaigning for equal pay in the workplace. Gender inequality is a serious problem in every part of life, including footy. But coming back to gaining the unexpected, I do also think there have been some fantastic gains, and we can't only look at the tough side. One of the extraordinary consequences of the United States election has been the emergence of this fantastic new wave of activism by so many women, both in the United States and in other parts of the world. You might have seen on the news the speech that President Trump gave to Congress just last week. There were many female members of Congress wearing white as a show of solidarity, and wearing white as a tribute to the generations of women who marched and fought for women's rights. A very, very impressive sight. And of course, here too in Australia, we've seen so many women standing up, getting out in the street, yet again, leading public protests. So many women drawing out into sharper focus the important issues. In fact, is that one of those pussy hats that we see over there? Well done. One of the most extraordinary women in our society is, of course, Rosie Batty, who's done so much to put the issues of family violence onto the front page, and it really, I think, shows to all of us that there is a new movement for change in our society. And I think, looking at the young women here today, we're going to see a new generation of women leaders. Sharon, you're doing a great job encouraging them here in the Illawarra. Now, I thought I might just tell you a little bit of my own story. Some of you might think politics is not for me. You might think I'm not an activist. You might think it's hard enough to manage your own life rather than thinking about how you could possibly do that in the public arena. Of course, by all of you joining in this women's leadership group, writing your essays, I just want to say to you, I think this is a demonstration of you agitating for change yourselves. When I was your age, I was at a local high school, Wangaratta High School in the northeast of Victoria in the 1960s and 70s. And I couldn't possibly have imagined then that I was going to end up spending 21 years in the federal parliament. In my last year at secondary school at Wangaratta High School, I just returned after a year in Japan and had my eyes really open to the world. And as a girl growing up in the country, was starting to form my own political views. I actually gave my first speech at school that year on Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch. My mother told me that it might have been a bit heavy. The women's liberation movement was, of course, at that time really finding its feet, and those of us who were of an age really thought our time had come. Gough Whitlam was on his way into power, so there was an enormous mood for change right across Australia. And just as a little reminder to you all about how some of the things that we take for granted changed almost overnight by the Whitlam government. In his first week in power, he removed the Commonwealth sales tax on the contraceptive pill and made it available on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. It's hard to imagine now that such a big decision that's changed so many women's lives was made by that Labor government in their first week in power. If ever you want an example of what governments can actually do to benefit people, I think it's a wonderful example. I spent quite a few months early in my adult life as a volunteer in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and of course through that experience really started to think about what I could do in my own life to make a more equal society. I got very involved in the one of the first women's refuges in Australia and campaigned for funding for women's refuges to support women escaping violence, and learnt that the women in the refuge were much better at Scrabble than I was. We spent hours at night finding ways to make sure that we provided friendship and support and, of course, a safe place for women to be. I had the opportunity during the 80s and 90s to work in two political offices in the second part for Brian Howe. He was the Deputy Prime Minister both to Hawke and then to Keating. And they, I think, really showed me that Parliament can make an enormous difference to people's lives. One of the reasons that I'm here in the Illawarra, including being here today, we have had a couple of very big pension forums over the last, yesterday, one in Nowra and one in Dapto. And one of the issues that was raised was by a woman who highlighted that in her working life, of course, there was no superannuation, and particularly for women. One of the changes that was made by the Keating government was, of course, the introduction of compulsory superannuation, but it is still the case that women retire with less money, have a much poorer retirement because of their history of work or history of caring. That leaves them in a much more difficult position. But nevertheless, it is a big issue that I think we need to take forward. And Sharon and I do have a great new parliamentary colleague in Jenny McAllister, one of our new senators, who's really taken this issue of women's superannuation up as something that she intends to do something about. When I decided to go into the Parliament in the mid-1990s, I knew that one of the things you can never rely on is knowing how long you've got. Diann mentioned all of the elections that both Sharon and I have stood for and fortunately won, but of course you never know whether that, well, Sharon might, but I certainly didn't know that I was always going to win. I think you've got to really be very clear about what it is that you want to do with your time in any walk of life, but particularly if you get the enormous privilege of standing for Parliament and having the opportunity to represent people. By the time that I was in the Parliament, it was 30 years since Gough Whitlam had introduced paid parental leave for Commonwealth public servants. And we'd seen some businesses introduce paid parental leave, but we were one of only 2 developed countries in the world that still didn't have a national paid parental leave scheme. So by 2007, when I was the Minister for Families, I decided that I was going to do something about this. And on the first day that I sat down with the executive of my department, I said, we are going to initiate an inquiry into what a paid parental leave scheme would look like in Australia. We did it, got the proposal through the Cabinet, got it agreed, got the Productivity Commission to do the inquiry, and with the ACLW and many unions, many women business leaders, we built the campaign for change. And by 2011, I had it through the Parliament and succeeded in getting the money committed to develop a national paid parental leave scheme. And I went to Westmead Hospital with Julia Gillard, who by this stage was the Prime Minister, and met the first mothers who would benefit from our paid parental leave scheme. That was in 2011. Since then, more than 800,000 families have benefited from our national paid parental leave scheme. That's what you can do in the Parliament. You can actually make a real change to people's lives. This is 18 weeks of pay at the national minimum wage, and it particularly benefits those casual workers, those women workers, and some men who really had no hope of negotiating leave with their employers. But one of the designs of the scheme was in fact that we wanted to encourage particularly those unions who could negotiate paid parental leave with their employers to be able to join the government scheme together with leave from employers. And so we do have many women benefiting from both the government scheme and employer-funded leave. Some of you might know that unfortunately the Liberal government in power at the moment have decided to insult women by calling those who have leave from their employers and from the government, they call them double dippers. Even though these women have negotiated with their employers to get leave, what we're seeing in the Parliament right now is an attempt by this government to effectively cut the leave that women have negotiated with their employers. It is a really retrograde step, one that we are campaigning very hard against. Are we Pit stop. But I think it also demonstrates that when you're in this, when you take on these issues, one of the things you have to be prepared to do is continue to battle them time and time again. You can't actually, in my experience, ever feel like you can give up. I actually think we might win this fight. I think we might have the numbers in the Senate to protect paid parental leave, but it's one of those things that we've campaigned very hard on with many women, many women's organisations right around Australia, and one that I hope will succeed in protecting. We did also introduce a scheme for dads. The dads can get access to the paid parental leave scheme. We also introduced dad and partner pay to make sure that dads get 2 weeks off, those first 2 weeks off when a new baby comes into the family. So I just want to finish by making a few general remarks really about where we are in politics, I think, internationally. I can't remember a time really when there's been such a low level of public trust in politicians and in government. Not in any particular government, this really is a general concern. And you can see this right around the world. It's been appalling really to see the treatment of first Julia Gillard and then Hillary Clinton. And it would be very easy for women to say, it's too hard, it's pretty ugly. But please don't do that. Please, I want you to see that you can make an enormous difference, both to your own lives, but also to the lives of women that you might seek to represent. I think it's more important than ever for women to be involved. There is this great new movement for change, and I would say to all of you, if you're pessimistic about what's going on, get involved. That's the best way to deal with the situation that we're in at the moment. I would say that the biggest threat to our democracy isn't nationalism or populism. In fact, it's apathy. So get involved. do what needs to be done to make sure that you support all those women around the world who are coming together for change. It doesn't happen by accident. You do have to fight for it. You have to fight for it like the suffragettes did, as we did as feminists in the 1970s, as Sharon and I have done in the Parliament. You can make a huge difference. You have to persuade people of the need for change, and of course that change can be so much to the benefit of so many people. It is the way in which we can build a more equal society. So please don't be passive spectators, get involved, make a difference with your own lives, and I think that way we will live in a much more equal society. Happy International Women's Day.
In my years, I've come to believe that gender inequality is almost like a disease. It's a disease with a history. It's been around for such a long time. We've faced intense discrimination.